John Miller had seen it all: the brutality of war, the loss, the fear, but nothing had prepared him for what he would face when he returned home. After years in combat, the Marine was finally back. His body ached from the weight of his service, his muscles stiff and scarred, but his heart raced with anticipation. His home, nestled quietly on the edge of a small town, was the one thing that had kept him going during the darkest times. He had imagined this moment for years, the day he would step off that plane and back onto American soil. The relief of being back, the familiarity of home. As the car passed the rolling hills and quiet streets, John couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. He was finally back to where it all began. The house, the yard, the quiet neighborhood. Everything seemed untouched, unchanged. It felt good. Too good. But as he turned onto his street, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It wasn't the familiar warmth he'd expected. Something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The feeling grew stronger as he pulled into his driveway, his car coming to a stop in front of the house. The moonlight hit the roof just right. The familiar porch lights flickered on. Everything was the same, yet there was an unsettling quiet that made John pause. He stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting him like a slap in the face. The silence was almost suffocating. It was then that he heard it, the faintest sound, a whimper. It was soft at first, but the desperation was clear. It came from the backyard. John stood frozen for a moment, unsure if he was hearing things. His mind raced. Could it be the wind? Could it be some stray dog? But no, his gut told him otherwise. This cry, this sound, it was familiar. It was the sound of a dog in distress, but not just any dog. It was his dog, his loyal companion. Maximum. Max had been there through it all. They'd fought side by side in the most harrowing situations, and now, in the stillness of the night, Max needed him. The realization hit him hard, and before he could stop himself, he rushed toward the sound. His legs, weak from years of war, carried him quickly toward the yard. Each step felt heavier as his heart began to pound harder. The urgency gripped him. And then, just as he rounded the corner of the house, he saw him. Maximum, his war dog, the one he thought he would never have to leave behind. But there Max was, chained to the corner of the yard, his body thin and frail, his fur matted, and his eyes, those eyes, filled with pain and confusion. John's breath caught in his throat. Max was in pain. The dog who had been his rock, his savior, had been forgotten, chained, abandoned. John took a shaky step forward, his heart breaking at the sight of his old friend. How could this have happened? How could anyone leave Max like this? Max's head lifted slowly at the sound of his name. He barely had the strength to stand, but his eyes locked onto John's with an unspoken plea. The years of fighting side by side flashed in John's mind in an instant. Max had been his protector, his companion in ways that words could never explain. John sank to his knees, tears welling in his eyes. He reached out his hand, his fingers trembling. This was the moment he had never wanted to face, but he knew he had to. He couldn't leave Max behind. Not again. John's heart pounded as he slowly approached Max, his breath shaky in the still night air. The chains that bound Max to the cold, rusted post seemed like a cruel reminder of the years of neglect that had passed since he was sent off to war. How had things gotten so bad? How had the people he trusted allowed this to happen? Max's eyes, though clouded with pain, still held a glimmer of recognition. John's heart twisted in his chest. The dog hadn't been abandoned by choice. He was a soldier's companion, meant to be cared for, loved, and respected. But there Max lay, alone, desperate for help. John reached out with one trembling hand, as though not sure whether he had the right to touch Max anymore. He was unsure of what to do. There was so much pain, so much regret, mixed into that moment. Max had been his constant companion in the most terrifying of situations, and now He was in distress, in a place that shouldn't have been his. Max deserved better. John's voice cracked as he spoke softly to him. "Hey, buddy. I'm here. I'm here." The moment the words left his lips, Max whimpered again. It was barely audible, but it sent a shiver down John's spine. He could hear the desperation in the dog's voice, could feel the trust that Max still placed in him, even after all the years apart. John reached down, brushing his hand lightly over Max's fur, and a sharp intake of breath escaped his lips. Max was cold to the touch, his body trembling slightly as he struggled to stand. His bones were thin and brittle, his coat lacking its usual sheen. John could feel the hollowness under the dog's fur, the evidence of neglect and mistreatment. It was as if Max's body had been drained of life. He wanted to help. He had to help. But what could he do? What had he come back to? The truth hit him hard. Max wasn't just a war dog. Max was family. And in that moment, John knew that there was no way he could leave his dog behind. Not now, not ever again. As John scrambled to untangle the chains, his mind raced. Who had done this to Max? Who had let him be forgotten like this? He didn't have time for the answers. He only had time to get Max out. He had no idea how long Max had been chained up like this, but the dog was clearly suffering. The more John tugged at the rusted chain, the more it became clear that Max wasn't just physically scarred. He was emotionally broken. Max didn't trust easily anymore. He had been abandoned by the one person he trusted most. John yanked at the chain one last time, and it finally snapped free. Max whimpered softly, as if to say thank you, but John could tell that the dog was still too weak to move on his own. Max's legs shook as he tried to stand, but he couldn't. His body wasn't capable of supporting him. It was clear that Max needed medical help. He needed care that John, as a veteran, was not equipped to give alone. And then, as John tried to lift him into his arms, something unexpected happened. Max let out a deep sigh, resting his head on John's lap. For a moment, it was as though the dog was saying, "I'm home." But what John didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both of their lives forever. Max had been through more than anyone could imagine, and it wasn't just his body that needed saving. It was his spirit. John carefully scooped Max into his arms, his hands trembling with the weight of the dog, not just physically but emotionally as well. Max's head rested against John's chest, his breathing shallow, and it broke John's heart to feel how fragile his once strong companion had become. The bond they shared as partners in battle, as friends in the darkest times, was undeniable, but now, in this moment, Max needed him more than ever. With each step, John's body screamed in pain, his old war injuries making it harder to carry the heavy dog, but he didn't care. There was nothing else in the world that mattered more than getting Max to safety. As he made his way toward his truck, John's mind flashed back to the battlefield. He had seen countless horrors, but none had shaken him as much as seeing Max like this, weak, abandoned, and chained. The weight of the situation hit him harder with every breath. He had left Max behind once during his deployment, and he'd never forgiven himself for it. But this time, there was no way he was going to make the same mistake again. This dog was more than just a companion. It was a part of his soul, and he would fight to the end to give Max the life he deserved. John gently placed Max in the back of the truck, trying not to cause any more pain. Max, with his frail body and worn-out eyes, seemed to understand, licking John's hand weakly. The gesture was small, but it meant everything. It was a sign that Max hadn't completely given up. He still trusted John. He still wanted to be a part of this world. But as John closed the truck door, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A low growl echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of tires screeching on gravel. Someone was coming. Someone was coming fast. John's heart raced as he realized the possibility that Max's suffering was far from over. Who could have done this to him? Who could have left him chained up, broken and forgotten? The growl grew louder, and John's grip tightened on the truck's handle as his mind raced. Could it be the people who had abandoned Max? Had they come to finish what they had started? John didn't wait to find out. He jumped into the driver's seat and slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The truck sped down the road, the tires kicking up dirt as the growling continued behind him. The pounding of his own heart filled his ears, and for the first time in years, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Max let out a soft whimper from the back of the truck, and John glanced in the rearview mirror. He could barely make out the shape of a figure in the distance, and with it, something else, a sense of danger, something much bigger than he could handle alone. As John sped away, the wind whipped through the open windows, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The shadows in the distance moved quickly, closing in on them. It was as if Max's suffering wasn't the only thing that needed to be confronted. John's past, his own demons, were now entwined with Max's fate. And whatever was coming, John knew he couldn't escape it alone. The truck bounced over rough terrain as the figure in the rearview mirror drew closer. John's eyes narrowed and his grip on the wheel tightened. Whatever it was heading straight for them, and he had no choice but to face it. The truck swerved sharply, the tires screeching as it narrowly avoided hitting a large rock. John's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, his mind racing faster than the vehicle could carry them. The growl grew louder, the sound so deep it felt like it was coming from the very earth beneath him. Whatever was chasing them was close, and John had no idea what it was. He had to protect Max, but he didn't know from what. John's breath quickened, and for a moment he almost felt like he was back on the battlefield where every decision could mean life or death. His mind flashed back to the dark, dust-filled days when every corner held danger, every sound was a warning. But this was different. This was personal. This was Max, his loyal companion, his only friend when the world had been a dark and lonely place. A flash of light in his rearview mirror startled him. He glanced quickly, his pulse pounding in his ears, and saw a silhouette, tall and dark, moving fast, and then the sound of the growl again, louder than ever. It was no animal. It was a vehicle, chasing them. John's heart stopped as he made out the shape of the other truck behind them. It wasn't just any truck, it was the same truck he had seen parked by the shed when he had found Max chained up. The one that had been abandoned, the one whose owner had clearly shown no care for the dog. With a sinking feeling in his chest, John realized that he wasn't just running from the past. He was running from the people who had abandoned Max. They were coming for Max now, and John would not let them take him back. His decision was made. John's foot slammed harder on the gas pedal. The truck jolted forward, dust and dirt flying behind them, the engine roaring as he pushed it to the limit. Max let out a soft whimper from the back, and John turned his head for just a second, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror. Max's face, still worn and frail, looked back at him with something John hadn't seen before. Trust. John couldn't lose him. Not after everything. Not after all the pain Max had endured. Not after the love and loyalty that had always been there. He had to protect him, no matter the cost. The truck behind them was gaining on them quickly, the roar of its engine louder now. John's heart raced, his mind frantically searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go, no roads to turn onto. He was trapped. The only option was to fight, and that was something John knew how to do. He had fought for his country, for his life, and now he would fight for Max. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles aching as he steered the truck onto a narrow dirt road. The truck behind him followed, the growl louder, now a rumbling engine in his ears. John's breath hitched. There was no turning back. But then, in the distance, John saw something that could be the only thing that would save them. The silhouette of a small farmhouse loomed ahead. With no time to lose, John slammed the brakes, swerving the truck onto a path that led to the farm. He knew it was risky, but it was their only shot. The truck behind them followed, not giving them any space. John barely got the truck turned around before the chasing vehicle was on their tail. Max's whimper grew louder. John glanced back once more. This was it. He had no choice but to stop running. Whatever came next, he would face it with everything he had. John's heart pounded in his chest as he came to a sudden stop in front of the farmhouse. The dust from the dirt road swirled around them, a thick cloud that blocked out the sun, making the world seem eerily quiet. Max let out another soft whimper, his body tensed with fear. John could feel it too, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The truck behind them skidded to a halt, its tires digging into the dirt as the engine roared. John didn't wait. He swung open the door of his truck, his legs feeling weak as they hit the ground. His eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. There was no turning back now. The men in the truck, the ones who had abandoned Max, were here. John's breath caught in his throat. They were getting closer, their shadows stretching out in the fading light. He could hear them shouting, but their words were muffled, drowned out by the pounding of his heart in his ears. Max's growl was low, barely audible, but it echoed through the stillness. In that moment, John didn't think about the danger. He didn't think about the physical pain or the fight he had ahead of him. All he thought about was Max, his loyal companion, the dog that had been through so much. He wasn't going to let these men take him away. Not again. With a deep breath, John steadied himself. He turned to Max, whose eyes were locked on him, trusting him to protect them both. The dog's body was trembling, but he stood firm beside John, ready for whatever was to come. John's voice was firm as he spoke to Max, though he barely recognized it as his own. "We're getting out of this, buddy. Together." Then, without warning, the men from the truck began to advance. John could see the look of disdain in their eyes, the same look they had when they had chained Max up and abandoned him. But there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before. The fear in their eyes as they saw John standing tall, determined to defend Max, was unmistakable. The first man took a step forward, but John held his ground. "You can't have him," John said, his voice unwavering. The man hesitated, sizing John up, but then something unexpected happened. Max, in a sudden surge of energy, stepped forward, his teeth bared, a low growl rising from his chest. The men stopped in their tracks, shocked by the dog's sudden defiance. Max wasn't just protecting John, he was protecting his home, his family. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. John's eyes never left the men, his body tense, waiting for their next move. Max stood between them, unwavering, his eyes locked on the men who had once tried to break him. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty written on their faces, and then, without a word, they turned and retreated back to their truck, slowly backing away as Max growled once more. John watched them leave, a mixture of relief and anger flooding through him. Max was safe. For now. John took a deep breath, his body finally relaxing as the danger passed. He turned to Max, his face softening. "We did it, buddy." Max's tail wagged, the first sign of relief in what felt like an eternity. John knelt down, his hand gently brushing through Max's fur. The bond between them had deepened in ways words could never express. The dog that had once been abandoned, forgotten, was now a loyal companion, one who had saved him as much as he had saved him. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene, John knew that no matter what came next, he and Max would face it together. They had already conquered the hardest part. They were family now. Nothing would tear them apart.